Okay, everyone, I'll have everybody take their seats, please, and we'll begin with our next presenter. So we're going to play a video first of our next presenter, and then she will come on and ask questions. And her name is Kat Lanteigne, and I hope, Kat, I or sounding it correctly. And she's the Executive Director and co-founder of Blood Watch. And as we've discussed in the last few CCU e-board meetings, this is becoming a real concern. And Kat is here to give us an update and is a little bit of a historical background on what's going on. And of course, we have members in Local 19 in PEI that are part of the blood services. So we're going to play the video first, and then Kat's going to come online with us.
Thank you. Before I begin, I would like to call upon my ancestors to join me in the room today and acknowledge that the intention set in my presentation is to ensure that no more harm is done. I'd like to also acknowledge two facts. One, 40% of the IVIG that is used today in the world has no clinical evidence for its use. And because of that, we strongly oppose the market-driven process of collecting paid plasma, because it negatively impacts patients who have no other alternative to a medication. We would also like to correct something that has been tabled in this meeting today. We don't believe any organization speaks for everyone, but our patients that we work with across the country, including patients in British Columbia, Ontario, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, believe that they have a right to ethically source plasma. Thank you for welcoming Blood Watch. Our organization is co-founded by tainted blood survivors, families, and patients who use PDMPs. Our advocacy efforts have profoundly impacted Canada's blood system in a positive way. As you are aware, we have taken a strong position against the deal CBS has made to sell off Canada's donor base to Grifols. CBS contracting its duties out violates both the mandate of CBS and two existing laws in Ontario and BC. The agents clause in the Voluntary Blood Donations Act that CBS and Grifols are attempting to jointly exploit is neither implicit or explicit in the legislation. Therefore, this deal violates current public policy in Canada and is not valid as it does not conform to the law. In Ontario, the amendment to add in an agent exemption for the paid plasma industry was explicitly voted down by legislators in 2014. Moreover, the law in Ontario also renders the act of a donor to receive payment for their blood illegal. It is remarkable CBS would ever champion a deal that puts donors in harm's way. We have confirmed with the Health Minister's office that no confirmatory letter was granted to support this deal and that no opinion was rendered by the Attorney General. Showing a government lawyer one line from a contract does not suffice as approval. And unless that has changed today, we still view that this contract is illegal. In BC, Health Minister Adrian Dix explicitly informed CBS on September 2nd, 2022, in writing, that the law was not intended to allow a private entity to establish collection sites in BC. So why did Dr. Schertel, our organization, and the BC Hemophilia Society, CBS is in regular dialogue with both Ontario and BC, and it is a clear understanding that what is occurring is within compliance of the law. We have also received formal correspondence from BC that the law will be enforced in that province. Furthermore, why does CBS believe that granting a monopoly of our plasma supply to one drug company serves the best interest for patients who don't use Gamunex? One of the most profound ethical examples of ethical breaches in the fake plasma story is that CBS has now embedded the organization in a conflict of interest as it established a relationship with Canadian Plasma Resources in 2010. It was not in 2015, as Graham Sher had publicly claimed. CBS aided CPR in their endeavor and did the same with Ripples in 2018 when CBS hired the company to consult on our public plasma plan and advocated for the agents clause to be added to the BC version of the Voluntary Blood Donations Act, which laid the groundwork for this deal. As a board of directors, you have committed to good governance, values which demand you hold CBS to the highest ethical standards, ensure it complies with the law, that it is transparent and accountable to the public good. Consider what you have approved with this contract. We have no legal levers, either federally or provincially, to protect our supply chain if you permit this deal to go through, and our voluntary donor base will be excoriated under your watch. This contract does not secure our supply chain. Grifols and Canadian Plasma Resources can redirect their plasma at any time, and it will not be in violation of either federal or provincial law. And we have confirmation from Health Canada that this is the case in writing. It should be duly noted that there are only 2 days of O and O negative blood in national inventories today, and there is no excuse for it. It's not the virus, it's not the storm, it's not COVID. Expanding the exploitative practice of procuring plasma from vulnerable populations and turning our blood donors in Canada into a profit stream at the source demonstrates an exceptional lack of discernment by CBS executives. I want to make it very clear to each of you. CBS has misled the public on multiple occasions over the course of a decade on the issue of paid plasma, and in doing so has violated the very basic principles of public trust. And I will say again, I know, because I was lied to as a citizen advocate and as the leader of the organization that represents people who were the most profoundly impacted by the blood system in this country, who are HIV positive and who live with hepatitis B and who have buried their family members.
Kathy, at a time, you wrap up, please.
We unequivocally, and I have the absolute support of my board and of our supporting organization and of our patients, ask that Dr. Graham Sher is removed as CEO of CBS and this contract with Ripples is rescinded.
Thank you. Very quickly, we're in full confidence in Dr. Sher and PDMT, as well as all the employees of Canadian Blood Services. So thank you for your advice, but we will not be taking it. I will also point out, and I know you in fact are directly made aware that Ontario did support our activities with Ripples. Correct that Minister Dix was not supported, and theory Ripples is not really at all in British Columbia, as we've said many times. I think the rest of your comments we've already addressed the multiple efforts, and now to go to the last speaker, who is
I know this year.
And Jen,
Hi, Kat. It's Kelly Johnson. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
And we can hear you loud and clear. And we heard you on your presentation. Thank you for being such a thank you for being such a strong advocate on behalf of all Canadians. We really appreciate this. This is serious business.
Oh, thank you.
Kat, if we can get you to introduce yourself and there's about 70 members of the Confederation of Canadian Unions that represent a lot of different type of workers. So there's right across Canada. So actually I'm quite proud now to be in BC if we've rejected it. So that's good. We got to get the rest of the provinces to do the same. And with that, I'll give you a little bit more lead-in time, and I know there's going to be some questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So I'll just give you a little bit of background quickly about how bloodwatch.org began. I actually started as a writer, and I am a writer, and I was writing a play about the tainted blood crisis here in Toronto. And I had an extended family member, my godmother's sister. Some of you might be old enough to know her. Her name's Janet Connors. She sadly passed away recently. She was an advocate in Nova Scotia whose husband was a hemophiliac who was co-infected with HIV and hepatitis C. And Janet, during the HIV and AIDS crisis and the tainted blood crisis, was one of the first women in Canada to come forth with her HIV positive status. And her and her husband, Randy Connors, were pivotal and critical in fighting for the Creever inquiry to happen. And Janet's efforts were deeply impactful in ensuring that spouses that were affected and children whose parents were affected were compensated by the Canadian government. And so my uncle also had HIV and subsequently died. So the HIV/AIDS pandemic in our family was sadly part of our family story. So when I decided to write a play about the tainted blood crisis and how it impacted Canadian families, I had launched a research project, and I had essentially expanded my scope, and I met a lot of the core advocates, the legal team, a lot of members of the legal team from Justice Creever, the medical experts at the time. And then we were in pre-production for the play in Ontario, in Toronto. And almost a year before we were about to stage the show, for-profit paid plasma centers appeared in downtown Toronto. And the first one was beside the Scott Mission, which is a shelter to feed and house homeless people in Toronto, because that's the strategy of the paid plasma industry. They go where the most vulnerable populations are to intentionally exploit them. And a CBC journalist had put the story on the news. I was in a very fortunate position that I had sort of recreated a circle of all these people that hadn't kind of gathered for a long time. And we rallied together with the labor organizations in Ontario, the medical community in Ontario, and we launched a campaign in tandem with my play to have the company shut down. And it worked. There's a lot of story behind that, but I won't take you down that road. We ended up touring the play in 2014. We advocated and lobbied heavily to the Ontario legislature, and the first Voluntary Blood Donations Act was passed unanimously by all parties. And the fundamental principles of Justice Creever's recommendations that blood and plasma are a public good and a public resource to be managed and maintained by our public blood operator were enshrined into law. And so it was an incredible accomplishment. We were told many times we would not get it passed, that we would not get, a united front in the controversial legislature, but we did. And everybody thought that was the end of the story. But in reality, what happened is the company, Canadian Plasma Resources, went to another province and they set up in Saskatchewan. And what we didn't know at the time, which of course we now know, was that Canadian Blood Services was not only fully aware of their actions, but they were helping the company do it by essentially taking a position that would not oppose paid plasma. And they had been in talks with the company prior since 2010 and knew all of their plans and expansion plans in the country. And they were actually behind closed doors, supported by Graham Sher. But Graham Sher, who is the CEO of Canadian Blood Services, was publicly stating, including at a talkback that we had for my play at the time, that he didn't want the company here. And that was incorrect. And sadly, we found that out later through Freedom of Information documents. So in the late Christmas of 2015, the company shows up in Saskatchewan, and we started to launch a national campaign to get other provinces, including Saskatchewan, to implement the Voluntary Blood Donations Act, because we were trying to run interference, because we knew that they would just work to expand across the country. We were able to get that act passed in Alberta and in British Columbia, which was in a record speed. I think we had every law passed by the spring of 2018 in those three provinces. So essentially, with those three provinces protected, even though we tried in Nova Scotia and we tried in Saskatchewan and we tried to get all the provinces to pass the law, we knew that the majority of Canadians were protected from being exploited, and we knew that our blood system fundamentally would be protected because we had the majority of the population. And Quebec, of course, operates their own blood system. What we didn't know at the time was that when we forced Canadian Blood Services to table a national plasma collection strategy in order to secure our supply, because they had forced patients here to be 80% dependent on import products from the United States and the paid plasma industry there, which is renowned for being one of the most exploitive blood collection systems in the world. They bus Mexican nationals over the border. Grifols does that along with CSL Behring for them to sell their plasma and then send them back. They are set up in the most impoverished areas in the United States. And a study that was released in, it's either 2020 or 2021, was a fulsome review that 80% of that product is sourced from people who are living in poverty or who are abjectly poor. So what happened was, when CBS tabled their first plasma strategy, they went to the governments and they asked for $1 billion, almost $1 billion to do it. It's not a $1 billion program. For example, just money-wise, CBS secured $60 million from the provinces and $20 million in infrastructure funds from the federal government and Health Canada, and that will equal 25% of our security of supply chain. So if you times that by 2, that does not make a $1 billion budget. So when the provinces said, you need to go back to the drawing board, CBS resubmitted their request to the ministers, and they only asked for 25% of that funding. And the reason that they asked for that is because they had, since 2018, hired Grifols to be the consultants on our national plasma program, and they had started to pave the way to sell the rest of our plasma collection contractually to Grifols, by agreeing in that contract that Canadian Blood Services won't set up close to where Grifols sets up. So essentially they're abandoning territory and fundamentally kind of making like mini blood farms for griffles, you know, to go and exploit certain people in certain areas. And so by doing that, they're enshrining and entrenching the paid plasma system in Canada. And it was actually CBS and the executives at Canadian Blood Services who are the architects of creating the for-profit American blood system in this country, because Grifols would never have been able to expand here without that contract, because we had these laws set up. So when the Conservative government took power in Alberta, one of the first things that Jason Kenney and his government did was to repeal our law. We fought that repeal, of course. We presented at committee. We advocated very diligently. They did it, of course, during the pandemic, which was, you know, hard for us to fight back virtually, but we did the best we could. And at that committee meeting, Graham Scher made a presentation on behalf of CBS, and he sort of, you know, defends the public blood system, doesn't support the repeal of the law, but in his presentation, he uses very specific language about, you know, how, you know, there's only certain ways that, I'm paraphrasing, that, you know, that for-profit system would work. There's not enough levers to secure the supply chain. He doesn't support the repeal. We have sourced documents that demonstrated, that was in June of that month, that he had actually sent a briefing note to all the ministers, already informing them that they had hired Grifols to be their consultants. So it was a dishonest show, because in reality, what was happening is that those wheels were already in motion in order to get Grifols the gig, essentially. So our law is repealed there. Apparently our advocacy was so tremendous that one of the MLAs had a meltdown and decided to travel when none of us could travel during COVID, because we stressed him out so much. So he went to Mexico. And so our law was repealed, and immediately Canadian Plasma Resources was almost open. So we know that that's their mode of operandi. They build when they get the thumbs up quietly from the government officials. And then once the legal levers and the legislation is out of their way, they rapidly expand and they open their doors. So after that, despite our opposition, CBS hosted a stakeholders meeting pretty much from out of nowhere, because we just thought, okay, well, that's repealed, but they're going forth with their plasma plan, because we didn't have any documents to tell us otherwise. And we were also had attended international conferences where we were watching CBS present and saying, this is what we're doing. We're going to bring Canada to 50% self-sufficiency, and we're going to do it through the voluntary system. And, you know, that's what we were being told. And we were invited, as well as many other stakeholders across the country, to a very high level meeting with CBS, hosted by CBS, to have a discussion about the security of supply. And we had asked questions about, you know, what that meant, and we didn't really understand. And we had it in January of, it's either 2021 or 2022. Sorry, it's all a bit of a blur right now. But we have this meeting, and at the top of the meeting, the facilitator CBS hired says to all of us, there's dozens of us across the country on this Zoom meeting, specifically says to the entire group, we are not here to talk about paid plasma. This is not a discussion about paid plasma. And one of the patient group heads that supports paid plasma said, well, why are we here if that's not the discussion? And then we just went on and had this very bizarre conversation with these very sort of broad questions that didn't make any sense to any of us. Well, to me, to our organization. And I had sent a note to an ally within the Canadian Federations of Nurses Unions. And I said, I think this is I think they've made a deal with a pharmaceutical company. I think they're going to use this as their consultant, you know, that they've consulted with stakeholders to the ministers in this country, and that this is a show. So that meeting closes, and I attend another the first after we could all travel again and go back to work, and I travel to a European International Plasma Conference. And when I'm there, which was in March, so it was 2.5 months after that meeting, I meet the head of the research group that does the research for the pharmaceutical industry. And he makes a mistake. I think he may have thought, even though I had my badge on, that I was with the Canadian Blood Services delegation, because there was only a few Canadians there. And he says to me, oh yeah, so Canadian Plasma Resources are going to set up in Nova Scotia, and how, you know, and CBS's deal with Grifols has gone through. And I said, I'm sorry, what did you say? And then I started to write the executives at CBS, and we did everything that we could to blow the whistle until we finally, and then Chris Hannay from the Globe and Mail chased the story, and so did The Breach, which is an amazing independent news organization. And despite the denials from CBS, we were able to out the fact that they had made this contract with Grifols by August of that year, which is a big part of the work that we do behind the scenes, is to get this information out to the press. And of course, we have to chase documents and chase leads and demand accountability. What happened after that was immensely troubling, because in our high-level meetings that we had directly with Graham Scher and directly with the board chair, the new board chair, which included the head of the patient group in BC, Curtis Brendel, who's the head of the BC Hemophilia Society. They represent people who use all types of different blood products, who don't have to be hemophiliacs, said to us in that meeting that both Ontario and BC supported the deal, and it was not true. BC adamantly denied the deal. They didn't even, the health ministers, when they were getting information from CBS, did not know that when CBS said they'd made a deal with Grifols, that CBS was issuing a monopoly of collection to the company. And so they were trickling information so they could get further down the line with Grifols and get this contract signed. So that was incredibly troubling because it's not good governance and it's not how you deal with stakeholders. But because we have a lot of influence and we have a reputation for being honest, and we do a lot of research, they didn't want us to know, because they were worried that we would be too effective in actually tabling information as to why this would be a terrible idea for our country and for patients. So that is why I just wanted to give you the background there, that is why we gave the presentation that we did in June. I highly recommend that everyone read an article. It's easily Googleable, pardon me, called A Bloody Mess by Ann Kingston, that was in Maclean's in 2017, because that gives a little bit of a background about where we were then. And essentially what happened was Health Canada and CBS just kept doing what they were doing behind the scenes, despite all of our efforts to gain funding, to gain a lot of support from your organizations and your memberships across the country, and from the public and to the legislatures, that the people that should have been our biggest allies and our biggest supporters, that they were actually our biggest adversaries. And one of the reasons why this is so troubling is because the premise that we cannot collect plasma in Canada is false. Quebec is already at 50% self-sufficiency. Multiple countries in Europe are at 50% self-sufficiency. New Zealand's at 90. Australia is over 50. I think they're almost at 60% self-sufficiency now. And what the self-sufficiency mark means is that the patients that don't have any alternative to plasma products are taken care of, and that the additional plasma product that exists can be used as for off-label use, or a physician has a decision, between, using a different kind of drug or a plasma drug. And we can do that within the next 3 to 5 years. And so the international evidence that exists, the Canadian evidence with our neighbor in Quebec that exists, all of the international recommendations in the world from every single public health organization and blood organization recommends that you should collect and manage your blood supply through a national operator, full stop, and that it should be voluntary for multiple reasons, which we can talk about later. So here we are. What's happening now? So Minister Dix is said no, thankfully. We are advocating. We still have not had a direct meeting. We've had meetings with his high-level staff members. We've shared our view. It is our understanding CBS has had multiple meetings with the Ontario government since our advocacy work, and that they are being given a golden handshake, I guess, behind the scenes, because the law has not been repealed. And so we expect that Grifols will be opening for-profit paid plasma facilities very soon in Ontario, which we, of course, will oppose. We are extremely concerned about the precedent that it sets, that private companies can make deals with public health organizations, and then they can just decide without, without any review of a law. Or the law to be tested, that they can do whatever they want, to feed their contractual needs. That sets dangerous precedents for all, everything outside of blood, including environmental concerns. And so the next question is, what can we do? What can you do? We are pushing hard on the Ontario government internally. You can launch public campaigns. A very effective tool is to request that the Auditor General in your respective provinces do a value for money audit for Canadian Blood Services. That's a really good option. That a letter is sent asking that Graham Scher and the current board of directors be removed from CBS. That is critical in our view, and that the Grifols contract be canceled. One of the selling points for the contract that CBS is championing is that Grifols bought a fractionation facility, which is a facility that makes the plasma product. They bought it from another company in Montreal. So they're saying, well, we have a contract with Grifols that states all of the plasma that they collect is going to be manufactured at this facility in Montreal. And then it can only be used for us, full stop. Right? So there's not an issue. We have an ironclad contract. Well, as we all know, that just doesn't mean anything, because fundamentally, if patients switch to a different product and they don't use Gamunex, or a new product, plasma product emerges and it's made by a different company, Grifols has the right to be able to take their product that is sourced in Canada and sell it to anybody in the world. Anyone. That is just a fact. And without these laws that we have in the provinces, and because we don't have a federal law that protects human tissue as a national resource, we are now vulnerable to have our blood supply controlled by a private international corporation. And sadly, that's where we have ended up today. I can say to you that at the beginning of this advocacy work, I did not expect to be here. It's sad, it's disappointing. All hope is not lost. And I'm here to answer any of your questions, and I hope I didn't go on too long. There was just so much to cover.
Thanks, Kat. No, you didn't. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions.
Hi, Kat. Thank you for this wonderful information. My name is Rosa Verdejo Williams, and I am a delegate from USA, York University Staff Association. I am quite scared with the information that you provided, simply because I come from an underserved community. I grew up in Jane and Finch in Ontario. My husband is from the States, so I've seen personally what you speak of in regards to the pay for profit. I just want to ask, have you approached Indigenous and BIPOC agencies, because these are the groups, these are the communities that are going to be targeted for this company? Have you approached our agencies or other organizations for support in regards to spreading the word and exposing what's going on?
We have not directly, we work with a lot of other organizations that have them under their umbrella. Like multiple organizations. We do a lot of work as well with the Canadian Health Coalition across Canada. So we rely on them to help us educate communities. And we share those concerns. I mean, it's just it's deeply problematic when we have the level of our national charity that's funded by $1 billion. You want people there who have really strong ethics, and you want people there who have really strong medical ethics. So any of you who are members of Canadian Blood Services know that although you can give plasma a lot more, like you can give plasma way more than you can give whole blood, the needle's larger and it's really hard on your veins. And so if people are in poorer health, and if people really need money and they're not going to be honest on their forms, and disclosing their personal health is what is a great concern. That's problematic. And you mentioned that you were, did you say university?
Yeah. Yes, I work at York University, yes.
Okay, so that's one of the big targets for these company or university students.
Yeah.
And it's a huge strategy in the United States. So one of the really good ways is through the student unions. I know that we've had some amazing articles. They weren't fostered by us. This is students speaking on behalf of themselves in the United States saying, what are you doing here? Like, you make it so difficult for me to attend school. And now you want me to go and sell my plasma to be able to buy textbooks. So the companies I would guess that Grifols will be in the beginning, they'll go close to universities because they won't be as brazen as Canadian Plasma Resources will. But I think one of the sicknesses that we really think when we think about this is they have a joint steering committee that they formed, Canadian Blood Services and Grifols. Grifols in their investors report from last year, it's online in their investors report, literally state to their investors the way that they were able to ramp up plasma collection in the pandemic was to target those who were suffering economically. It's just shocking. So to know that our executives at Canadian Blood Services, who are entirely publicly funded and have a duty to do this job, they have one job to do, are sitting there with Grifols executives choosing the populations in a group that Grifols will exploit. It's for us, it's beyond reprehensible. And so, those things have to, we can certainly educate and provide information, but to answer your question, no, not directly. We have relied on our allied organizations.
Good morning, Kat. My name is Will Christie. I'm with ACES, a union out of the University of Manitoba. So I got two questions. One is, I guess, where's the status of this in Manitoba?
Yeah.
And then the follow-up question is, I am a proud blood donor. I really do appreciate that fact. Is this a similar scandal to what happened with the Canadian Red Cross back with the whole hepatitis issue back, I don't know how many decades ago, but thank you.
I'm really glad you're from Manitoba, because now that we have a new government in Manitoba, we have some hopes. So there has been one, so this was grandfathered into Creever. There is one facility which is on the University of Manitoba campus, which makes a very rare drug to help prevent stillbirths in women. And so they get a rare blood type, they get, I think it's Rh negative. That very small facility, because the donors were very specific and they would have to come at the time, from a long way away. They were whole blood donors. And so they were essentially compensated for that donation. And that was listed in Crever as a rare circumstance. So it was grandfathered into Crever. What's happened is that that place, that CanGene facility that became ProMedics, has now been bought by Grifols. So Grifols is going to expand in Manitoba, both on campus, because they've started to collect paid plasma, and beyond, to get to I mean, they'll be unstoppable because nobody's stopping them, right? I mean, Health Canada just gives whatever paid plasma company wants to, operate a license. So it's a huge concern of ours in Manitoba. And one of the ways to pass the Voluntary Blood Donations Act there is to do what Crever had done, which is to grandfather the current facility that's enlisted as a rare circumstance and stop the expansion of any and all other paid for-profit plasma systems. To answer your second question, right now, I mean, we're always worried about the next bloodborne virus. The concern for us is not a pathogen in the actual blood supply at this time. The concern is for the system itself and for the safety of the donors, because the for-profit paid plasma industry negatively impacts whole blood, and it makes our blood system more expensive. For example, the blood system in America is 4 to 5 times more expensive. It costs more because they create market competition for donors. And we are in an emergency situation right now, which is not being covered very well in the media, because we are on the verge of a national whole blood shortage. And a big part of that is because they're creating these for-profit paid plasma facilities. So, like, people are getting cultured that you don't have to give, that you should be paid. And so that right now those are our strongest concerns. But I think in reaction to the concern about what the same behavior that we're worried about is, that culturally, Canadian Blood Services, in our view, is behaving very similarly, because they're not acting in a transparent way, and they feel like they have to use subterfuge in order to meet their goals. And we believe that's wrong. So we believe if they invited people to that stakeholders meeting, that they should have disclosed their plans, and that everybody should have been afforded the opportunity to engage with their legislators and our health ministers in our respective provinces, and to be able to be steadfast in providing evidence to CBS on why we believed that kind of plan would not serve patients or the Canadian health care system at large.
Follow-up question from Manitoba, Chris McCann, also from ACs. I've seen CanGene building on our campus. I saw it change to Prometric. Those were just words I didn't really understand. How can we be allies? Manitoba seems like it might be a small but open opportunity. How can we be allies?
The best way to be allies right now would be to advocate for the Voluntary Blood Donations Act to be passed and adopted by the new government, and to get them to actually engage and look at this issue from a ministerial position. Because what's happening right now is that none of the health ministers are holding CBS accountable. And because they appoint the board members, right? They are contractually obligated, because we have the memorandum of understanding that all the provinces have signed, to uphold the voluntary blood system. And we want them to be accountable. So right now, a letter to the premier, and I don't know if they have a cabinet yet, would be the most effective, asking for a meeting to say, we don't want this expanded in our province. We don't want our population to be exploited here. Canadian Blood Services needs to do their job. Doesn't matter what deal they've made with Grifols. It's ridiculous. They literally made a deal for a drug we're already supplied with. Like, it's like absurd. That would be the most helpful.
Well, I encourage you to work with Kelly and the CCU to get that going in Manitoba, and we would be helpful to that.
Thank you.
We have some more questions, Kat.
Hi, Kat. My name is Teddy. I'm also with ACs in Manitoba, and my pronouns are he and him. And thank you for your presentation. It was very informative, and I'm definitely going to check out that article in Maclean's and some other things. I got a couple of questions and some comments. The first one is, yeah, like, or actually, here's the comment. So yeah, University of Manitoba, like one prominent poster on campus for encouraging people to donate plasma is in the gym, in the exercise facility. And it's like, talk about a rebrand, like it's got a person in mid rock climbing, and it's like, it's really targeting students with this sort of like, and anybody with this sort of like, oh, it's part of, you exercise, you're healthy, and you could just see how that kind of marketing could really like present itself so innocuously, but it's still in a really kind of sanitizing some of the harm that it causes. A question for you is, thinking like from a big picture systemic kind of thing, and you might have touched on this and I just might not have picked it up, but like, do you have any sense of what kind of like the companies that are moving to get more of this, like Griffel and other things like that, like what kind of money is there for them to make in all of this? I heard you talk about the budget, but I'm just wondering like how much of a force, like, do you have any sense of like how much of a profit motive is there, like numbers wise? Because I know that some of these medical companies in the for-profit sector are quite huge, and maybe I don't know about this one in particular, but it's a big sector, and I'm just curious about that to get a sort of an idea about what we're up against in a way. I'm going to just ask a bunch of questions and feel free to answer any of them or none of them. And then the other thing was that, did you have any, so this kind of problem of taking something that should be for people's health, public good, all that kind of stuff, which is true, and moving it into a private commodity for-profit kind of realm is horrible. It has problems, whether you sanitize it and make it look like everyone's going to have like nice, bright, sunny lattes at Starbucks, or whether you show more of the dark side of it. That's a problem, and it goes beyond just this. So I was wondering if there's like, if in big picture kind of way you've connected with other people or contextualized it in that kind of general privatization, commodification problem, which we're sort of up against at large. Especially because people, like everything you said about preying on the vulnerable who have economic vulnerability, because that's how capitalism works. It's just part of that big problem. Last two things are, what are the biggest challenges in this advocacy you're doing, or any lessons? If you have anything to share there, that's really awesome to hear. And I'm not saying this is a joke, but like, I think this would make a really good movie because it's so informative, like what you're saying, and there's so many steps to it. And part of getting more people aware about things has lots of ways that can happen. So I'm just saying, I think it would be a great movie, not just for entertainment, but for like a call to action. Anyway, thank you very much. And those are my comments and questions.
I think you just brought up a really good idea in terms of how you can be allies, is to reposter. We could help too with some of that language, is reposter the university campus and engage with the student union there. And basically, start to inform them about what the actual paid plasma industry does, and so is that something that you want to contribute to? Because the reality is that any of those students could go donate plasma to Canadian Blood Services and it would go to a Canadian patient. And because Canadian Blood Services has to maintain, even though Health Canada regulates the companies in terms of donor intake, Canadian Blood Services has an obligation to every donor. They just have a health obligation to every donor. These private companies don't. They don't. So, if a nurse at Canadian Blood Services or somebody who is intaking you sees you are not well, or they are concerned, or anything, that they will ensure that patient or that donor, is taken care of. And we don't have that kind of oversight with the private companies. It does not exist. What Health Canada does as a regulator is it regulates the rules, and it makes sure the facility itself, you know, has the equipment that they have in that facility, and they do spot checks. So postering the university would be really helpful. That's a really that would be wonderful. And the excuse me, to answer your question about what kind of money, so Grifols is set to make maybe $500 million by this deal in Canada in perpetuity off of Canadian plasma, and more, for depending on how they expand, because they have bought Canadian Plasma Resources. So they are, you know, they're a giant. So Grifols Pharmaceuticals is what Monsanto is to glyphosate. They are one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. They're giants, and you know, we spend a lot of time fighting them, and here and internationally. So you know, that's why they want it. They're not here to be nice. They know that they can just secure an ongoing profit off of Canadian plasma. The biggest challenges that we face in advocacy is the ignorance of the roles and responsibility of the different levels of government and of Canadian Blood Services. So we know them and we understand them well, because some of our co-founders were former Creever lawyers. And we were the head advocates on having these laws passed. What's really interesting about the laws is that in British Columbia, when we were there reviewing the law, we saw the language in that specific law in BC under the Voluntary Blood Donations Act was different. So it had added the agents clause, right? It said, basically, you know, Canadian, only people that can collect, you know, blood and plasma in Canada is Canadian Blood Services. And then it says, and or their agents. And we said, whoa, 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 whoa. What do you mean they're agents? There's no agents. There's just Canadian Blood Services. And we were told that Canadian Blood Services wouldn't support the law unless that clause was in. And so there was nothing that we could do. So we just had to take it as is, and we got the law passed. And then we just found out last year that documents revealed that it was intentional, and CBS had made sure that it was in there because they'd already hired Grifols Pharmaceuticals to be the consultants. So they were working. I mean, imagine if you think of that, like, what is even happening? Like, literally our charity was working to manipulate a law to lay a groundwork for a deal that then they said they weren't doing, but they were actually doing. And so that's the biggest challenge, is to understand when you're advocating. Most health ministers don't understand the blood system. They just fund it. So they don't understand what their role is and how much pressure they can actually apply on Canadian Blood Services, which is a lot, because they can replace board members, and they can also tell Graham Sure no, because they're the funders. And there's also a lot of confusion currently now, because in our view, the CEO and the board of directors just have been involved in a corrupted process. So we are advocating for an investigation and an audit of their organization. And then, I mean, one day we'll make a movie. I don't know. They had 3 security guards for me when I made that presentation. That CBS brought in Alberta. You know, all 5 and 6, 5, you know, whatever, 5, 6, they were terrified about somebody coming and talking about accountability. So unfortunately, that's become, you know, what we thought we were doing for the good and supporting their organization and securing funding and protecting them, and therefore protecting, you know, donors and patients in Canada. All of those efforts, they were working very diligently behind the scenes to undo.
All right, Kat, we have time for just one more question.
Thanks. My name is Sunny. I also work for York University and York University Staff Association. Actually, so one of the things I never realized before today, because I've given blood before, but I always thought Canadian Blood Services was like a governmental part of the government, right? And actually, it's a charity. It's not part of the government, and I just wonder, like, how much of the problem do you think is that structure itself? Like, wouldn't it be, like, do you think it would be better if it was just Health Canada or something that was administering this whole thing, and there wasn't this third party, which sort of seems to give cover for them to create different rules? I also just think that this is sort of a capitalism problem, right? Where it seems like they want to have deals with private companies that can make a profit. And so why do we have private companies involved in this at all? Like, why doesn't the government just do the collection and all of the things that these private companies are doing?
That's you've touched on some really good points. So we never want Health Canada to run anything when it comes to the blood system, because the agency itself is so problematic. They often side with private corporations. So Health Canada has violated their position. They should not be giving these companies licenses to operate in this country. So they're part of our problem. They're not there to solve the problem. So as the regulator, what they're supposed to do, they have one job, and it's to make sure that the blood is safe. It is to make sure that nobody else ever gets infected with a bloodborne pathogen. And it's to make sure that the facilities that are collecting are complying with safety standards. That's their one job. So they do that. But what they also do is they issue these companies licenses. And we tried to get a federal version of the Voluntary Blood Donations Act passed. We had it tabled as a Senate bill, and they just tore it apart. Because sadly, the federal government looks at anything like this as innovation and expanding industry across the country. So the current administration, it was, had started with the Stephen Harper's government briefly, and sadly, Justin Trudeau's government, and every single one of his health ministers subsequently have been major champions for profit plasma in Canada. So we are here because of Health Canada as well. What's happened with Canadian Blood Services, sadly, shouldn't be happening, but it is. And that has to do with the leader that is in power. So Justice Creever had set up Canadian Blood Services specifically as an arm's length organization with a very specific mandate with a board of directors. So what's happening now wouldn't happen, because, a big piece of what the Creever inquiry did was it really laid out, it's 1,500 pages long. I've read it a million times. Is it really laid out how the web of the for-profit motive gets in the way of public health care and the traps that come along. And so, we safeguarded and created a new organization in order to have a national blood operator that was accountable and transparent, held to the highest ethical standards. But when you have the particular leadership that's been in place that works with industry to undermine all that, it becomes corruption within. So I guess my point is that I don't think it's about another agency. I think it's about demanding that the one we fund behaves in the manner that they are mandated to and that the public expects them to.
All right. Thank you so much, Kat, for joining us, taking time in your Sunday morning. I know everyone is appreciative of the work that you do. This has been very informative. And on behalf of the CCU, thank you very much for doing this.
Okay, thank you. I'm so glad my cats didn't embarrass me. Bye.
Bye. Enjoy the rest of your day.